Hello, and welcome back to the second session today, part of the event called Bold Buildings, hosted by Smart City Sweden. The topic is healthy and sustainable buildings. My name is Susanne Rudenstam. I'm Managing Director for Swedish Wood Building Council. The purpose of this discussion is to talk about how wood and wood construction could be used in the realization of healthier and more beautiful built environment, regardless of whether it's homes, public buildings, or working space. Environments where people thrive and develop buildings that last over time. I will also invite you all listeners to take part in the discussion and to post your comments or questions in the chat. With me here in the studio, I have Karin Löfgren, an architect at AEX Architecture and also head of sustainability, and Frida Tjernberg, structural engineer at Byggnadstekniska byrån. Most welcome to you both.
Thank you.
And to start with, could I ask you what your definition of healthy is? Starting with you, Karin.
If I take the definition by the World Health Organization, then they state that health is not the absence of disease. It's the well-being both mentally, physically, and socially also. So that's a much broader, a much more positive, constructive way of looking upon it. Then you talk about the human being, but I would like to extend that health is also encompassing the surroundings that the earth, sort of. And thirdly, I would like to say that health is not a momentum. Health is something that you have to look upon at a timeline. What you do now affects what you go into tomorrow. So it's mental, physical, and social well-being. It's about the human, and it's about earth, and it's stretched in time. So that's my
So it's
take on
quite
it.
holistic, both
Yes,
in terms
very.
of concept and also regarding time.
Yeah.
Thanks. And you, Frida?
I would say environmental-wise, it would be basically not, as Karin mentioned, not the absence of risk or the absence of danger, but an environment where you could thrive, where you have all of the surroundings that you need to feel your best, basically, and also, of course, over time, sustainability, that it should be healthy over time, not just for the current moments.
So I take from your answers that healthy environments it's slightly larger than just the non-toxic or levels of greenhouse gases.
Absolutely, it's much wider.
Could it be imagined that we could move from a more defensive stance where we ensure that the people are not exposed to dangerous substances or bad environments to a situation where actually buildings and environment could contribute, could actually be part of adding something to a healthier environment? What is your opinion?
Yeah, I think definitely, and it comes back to what we talked about with thriving, an environment in which you can thrive, where you're able to be your best or feel your best. And I think for sure, if we go from just sort of eliminating the negative factors, if we can also ensure that we get positive factors, it will be easier for us to thrive and have a healthy life or a healthy body, or whichever way you look at it. Definitely, and I think we should work towards that, to not just do not bad environments, but also make good environments.
And I think also that we have had a tremendously development in new building materials coming up from the 1950s or 1960s. And that has been an enormous, there's a reason why we came up with so many new materials, because we had a need to develop. But now we also see that some of those new materials has turned into problems, health problems of people. So now we tend to look at, okay, what works? And that I think we are more aware of today, because it's like a race with all new chemicals and new materials. that are adding into all the construction materials all around. And we know that we have a big health risk there, and talking about toxic cocktails and so on. But that's on the other hand, or that's what's hazardous in our building materials. But then you also have, I think you could say, hazardous architecture. That some environments and social environments does actually make people not thrive healthy. That causes stress and causes bad environments where that might be dangerous socially and so on. That's a huge risk. I mean, that you really have to look from city planning also, then how you plan houses and architecture for healthy workspaces and healthy schools, and so that's.
So is this discussion more present now within the discussions of city planning?
Well, I'm talking out of the Swedish context. I cannot talk for anything.
No, that's fine.
So, present in Sweden, yes, indeed.
Among your clients?
Yes, and among politicians and the municipalities also think that how can we, with as little economical input, get the very best output for as many people as possible.
Is there also I was thinking about because we're talking a little bit about the physical aspect, so hazardous materials and emissions possibly from some materials, but is there, from an architectural point of view, a way to design a building so that you get a good, should I say, a good feeling when you walk into a building? Is there a way to think about the mental health aspect and how the building makes you feel as a user?
Indeed, and on many levels, of course. Also, from the city planning level, I mean, with now perhaps we're getting into in the fringes of the subject, but for example, you have the space syntax analysis that you could do on city planning to see how street connects, and you can actually say here is where the most crime will occur. You can run that through a computer program, and you can also say, here is where the best placement for a bank or for a shop, or that's a placement for that. But also inside a building, of course, architecture is to form space in a way that is expressing an atmosphere. And that atmosphere can really give you empowerment, give you strength socially and in your life. I mean, a school can really be oppressive, sort of, in their architecture, but also to lift and give courage and encouragement, I think.
Yeah, so school is a very good example of where you really are affecting, especially young individuals.
Yes, and it's about how do you meet, how do you feel when you enter into this space? Do you feel that the space is working with you, or do you feel that you have to fight to be able? You have a long corridor, dark, no light, and you have to go to reach the classroom at the other end and reach a lot of other students. So I mean, there are definitely ways to work with architecture.
Yeah. I think perhaps we should get back to that because it's really interesting. But I was also, to start with, Karin, you work for IX, one of Sweden's bigger architectural practices in Sweden. You're a senior architect, but also holds a position as a strategist for wood construction and sustainable development. Could you describe a little bit of your work?
Yeah. Before I entered as being employed in this company, I was very curious because they had made some really nice woodwork in that office. So that's why I was interested in this particular company. So when I entered into that company, I had the in my work was to try to take the knowledge that already existed within the company and to see to that with the new emergence of new wood technology that has happened during the last 10 years, really, try to spread that knowledge as much as possible among all my fellow architects, and also to see to that the new wood building projects that we were engaged in. As soon as you have a new client and you have a new project, you also get new knowledge. And that knowledge will be within those people who has been working with that specific project. So the important thing was to spread the knowledge among everybody in the company. And then when we got a new project working with wood, basically, to see to that client gets the very best competence in the case of wood. So I was like a spider pushing and pulling people and just get their knowledge that already exists there, moving.
Is there an interest? Is it more about pushing or pulling? Is there an interest for wood and wood construction among and new materials among your colleagues?
Yes, there are, really. But it's been a progress in, how should I say, it's been very interesting 4 years I've been there, because the commissions has changed. And I feel that it's going faster and faster now. So there are more projects coming in, and that's really, really interesting. So I think my work has been increasing, and it's been so much fun in that. And also the sustainability part has been increasing and that completely goes together, those two parts.
Why is it increasing? What do you think? Why is it going faster now? What is the main driver?
I think because there are 10 years ago, many of the wooden projects were a large part was innovation, and there was a higher percentage of risk for the commissioner of the projects, because we didn't have that much best practice. Today, we can always talk to other clients or other project owners and get experience and consultants that have done it before. So we can concentrate more on a lower risk in the project, because we already have a best practice, and that's much more smoother way of working today than it was 10 years ago, I think.
That's interesting. I guess the same goes for you, Frida, but we'll get back to you very, very soon, and perhaps we'll look into
some of the
projects.
Yeah. This is old project, and I was asked to put together some pictures to show some aspects that I really feel are important. This is a dressage hall outside Rosersberg Castle, and this project was made with the idea to have the very, very simplest construction. So it's really a tectonic project where you have the wood beams and a CLT slabs forming both the wall and the roof, sort of in one smooth movement. And the nice thing with this one is that it's using a minimal amount of material. And I think that's a very important aspect, to not overuse the amount of material. Just because you can use wood to everything, you shouldn't. You should try to be careful about the product, sort of. So this hall is made with no, how do you say, spiel, with no rests, no cut off.
Waste, yeah.
Yeah, no waste. So we just used the finished slabs and put them as the roof, and everything was pre-cut and done in an industrial way, but it was a unique design. So take please the next picture. And this, I chose this. This is from the Royal Music Academy, and it's wood panels in plywood applied for acoustics along the walls in the concert halls, and they are used to form the architecture of the room together with the acoustic scenery of the room. And they are made in such a way that perhaps it's not possible to see here, but the colored tone on it is very thin, so you can actually see the wood through. And I think that gives a feeling that you are surrounded by wood material that gives a warm tone in the room, but also a warm feeling in the room, because you know by heart that you can bend wood. And then to see that around you, it's like you bend wood in an instrument, and you bend it in this room as well. Mm. Is there time for another one, or is it?
Yes, sure.
Whoops. This is also a how do you say, equestrian hall?
Equestrian.
Yeah. In Flyinge, where we also used wood as the thinnest material possible for the roof. And it's like 260 millimeters slabs of CLT wood forming the roof. And it's a cold hall, so there's no insulation in it. But also in these kinds of buildings, it's quite important to have the correct moisture of the ground and the earth where horses walk around. Mm-hmm. And here also wood is a very nice material because it handles moisture properties very nicely. And it also gives a very nice feeling in the air. So that's another property of wood, which is quite nice. And this is from, it's a grave from 900. That's a cover on where you come very close to the wooden structure, and also, which one thing that I like a lot to work with the construction. Yeah. Yes, and to really you can touch the construction, and that's also tectonically very self-explaining.
Yeah,
would you say that?
Self-explanatory. Yeah, it's very prominent how the building is held up and the structure of it. Yeah.
So let's stop there.
Yeah. Thank you. Very, very nice to see some actual examples also. And we will get back to best practice. But I will also turn to you, Frida. You I mean, equally important for realizing the assignment is the role of the designer and the structural engineer. And you are a structural engineer specializing in wood. What made you interested from the beginning to go into the wooden path?
Yeah, to go that way. So basically when I was at university, I was studying all kinds of materials. As you do, there's structural steel and concrete and all those materials. And I think because I studied in Stockholm and Sweden, is also quite big in the concrete and steel industry. It's quite heavy on that. So basically the training that we were given was a lot about those kinds of materials. And then I actually did a year abroad in the UK. And in the UK, they were very into already the large timber projects. So a lot of that in my exchange studies were actually about timber construction. Mm. And I realized that everybody was telling me that, oh, it's Sweden, we buy all our timber from Sweden. You must make everything with timber in Sweden. And I realized when I got back home that actually there weren't that many projects. And then when I started looking into it as an engineer, and when I finished school, I realized that it wasn't because you couldn't do things technically with timber. It was because there was a lack of knowledge. We'd had this kind of not ban, but we had these restrictions on timber construction for a long time, which meant that we had generations of engineers that had never gotten training in real projects with timber. So there was a lack of experience and a lack of knowledge. And when I started working with timber projects and doing the calculations, I realized that it's not very different from steel or concrete, but there are a lot of projects that were being built, and this is about 5-10 years ago. There were a lot of projects being built with concrete and steel that might actually have been better suited to be done with timber. But it wasn't that the clients didn't know that they couldn't use timber, but if the engineer only comes up with options with steel and concrete, then they won't know to ask the question. So I started getting interested in offering basically timber engineering options for the projects that we were seeing. And for some projects that we had, when I was a junior consultant, we saw that things couldn't actually get built with steel and concrete for some places. So for example, I have a project which I have a picture of here, which is a large housing project in Stockholm. It's very central, and it's on the top of a number of tunnels. So they covered over a number of roads and the railway, and then the city wanted to build housing on top of the existing tunnels. And so the tunnels were already built, and they already had restrictions with regards to loading. And then the builder comes in and they want to build, not just a small house in the middle of Stockholm. They wanted to build multi-story housing on these places, and we were looking into what could you do at this site with these loading restrictions. And for this particular site, it's you can see 2 buildings in the shot now, but there's actually 4 of them. In that particular spot, the conditions for the underlying tunnels were such that massive timber was basically the only viable option to do this in a good way. And we were talking to the developer, and we were talking to the architects, and the architects had already actually done a proposal for these timber buildings, and they just wanted a place to put them. So we sort of acted, as you said too, as a spider in the net, and made sure that our client who wanted to build with timber, and then we had this we were doing other projects in this area. We knew that there was this part of the land that wasn't really being used yet, and then we had the architects with this proposal. So we sort of connected everybody, and then today the 2 of the 4 houses are built, and the other 2 are sort of in the process. So it's for me, it started as an interest of, why am I not able to calculate timber? I need to learn to calculate timber. I need to be able to offer this to clients. And then it's sort of snowballed into me being able to actually help people realize that you can build things with timber. And I think for me, the overlying thought when I go into work in the mornings is not that I'm not the client. I'm not deciding what we're going to build, but I don't want there to be clients in Sweden who build things with steel and concrete just because they couldn't find a timber engineer. That cannot be sort of a stopping point. So if I can offer that with my colleagues as well, then I think we have an option to actually build more with timber in Sweden, and we're starting to see that happen, as Karin say as well. There's a continuous growth there.
And in this case, with this specific both land and the building, then wood was an enabler for also optimization economically. Yeah, because it depends. Either way you look at it, gravity is the same. So it's basically in this particular place, it's the weight of the buildings that is restricted because the tunnels can't be reinforced. They're already there. That's not in the scope. So if you build it with a heavier material, you need to build less, basically, which means less housing and less money in for the client. So this is also a good example of the best practice that now is being evolving and developed as we speak. There is, this time in timber construction is really exciting because now we're starting to have these examples and we have the learnings.
Yeah, and I think we also need to, and I think we need to be clear about that. We're seeing more timber projects because we're now able to identify the economic timber projects. As you talked about earlier, it's not only the innovation and the early stages and those sort of very special, specific projects. It's more of a mass construction, or there's a larger volume because we're able to identify which projects will have a gain economically on being built with timber. There's a value.
I think there's one other point that's quite important, and that's I have the feeling that we have a special atmosphere based upon sharing of knowledge in this construction, in the wood construction, and also we have that in the sustainability that we're working with. That we everybody know that, for example, after this project, you share the knowledge and you are open to collaboration between all the consultants that has been involved are very free to share their knowledge so that we can to help each other to
So it's a more generous mindset, or
yeah, much more generous mindset, I should say, and that helps this evolution of going to try to build more, build better, and it's a very positive atmosphere with this, and that I think is a change from previous decades, I would say. So that's something new, and that's very positive.
Yeah, that's interesting, and perhaps it's also because we don't have time.
That it could very well be that the driving force in this is the environmental questions and how should we solve that. I mean, in previous problems that we've had not been that kind of time limit as we have now. So that opens up people to collaboration, and that's very positive.
Yeah, you want to see the change.
Yeah. I mean, quite a big part of course, is the structure, the timber frame, the connections, the knowledge on load bearing, and as you mentioned, Frida, you weren't offered to learn that when you studied, but also the issues around air quality, the possibilities of having visible wood inside are also qualities that are now being more afterthought or asked for. How do you see the learnings and the knowledge around those aspects?
We had.
Do you want to start?
No, but we could start together because when we had our little project together, one of the questions was we made a project with a client, and the question was, what happens if we have 10 floors, 10 stories, or 16 stories, or more than 20 stories?
Yeah.
And then the question was, with the construction and with the fire regulations, what effects do we get from building these 3 levels of storages? And the discussion was around how much visible wood is possible to have in these 3 different.
Yeah, and I think we see that a lot in the early stages of design, that there is a question that the visible wood is sort of a governing factor. They want to know if we do it like this, how much visible wood can we get, or if we do it like this. And it's an interesting question for us as engineers, because there's a difference between, of course, a visible timber structure that's load bearing, or if you just want visible wood and it's okay if it's a cladding or stuff like that. So but if you have a timber structure, why would you put more wood on top of it? You want to see the structure, and that's, as an engineer, that's a question that we don't have with the other materials. Nobody is interested, because they're basically protected from fire, or concrete is fireproof in itself. So with timber, there's another aspect. We have to be able to give dimensions quite early that also account for the burning of the timber.
Why is that? Why are your clients asking for visible timber, do you think?
Karin?
Is that aesthetic, or?
There are many reasons. Many clients want us to have, for example, a wooden facade, which me myself is not so happy about. Always, if you have 20 storage high, I'm not sure that wooden facade is the very best, but there is a a reason that you want to show that this is a wooden house. It's made of wood in the bearing system, but we can handle that as well. But there are, for example, as a theme of today here, there is health aspects on it, really strong health aspects that on the visible wood in some instances. And there are aesthetic reasons, but just during the last year we could put the economy factor to it when we start calculating the carbon dioxide, because why should you put plaster on the wood when you don't have to, if you can arrange for the fire safety in another way? So it comes to optimization thought. So we as architects, we try to put optimization together with the economy, together with the acoustic and the fire and the statics.
Yeah.
So there are so many different factors for this, and they all turn into that. Well, it's not so good idea to because if you can have the wood visible, you don't have to pay for gypsum or concrete. You don't have to pay with extra carbon dioxide. Perhaps you don't have to pay with
the labor, just putting
labor.
plaster up.
Yeah. If you can put that together with accomplishing what you want in architecture, and then at the same time also have a healthy environment, then there are many factors that points in a direction that is interesting to look into.
Yeah, you seem to be all covered there. The idea of the kind of well-being in wood, and you like to have wood just for purpose of well-being, that is perhaps an area that is now growing. But do we have any research or studies that actually give us the proof that this is the case?
I should say that first of all, it's very difficult to have studies about health. I think that's one of the most difficult subjects, and there are of course many difficult subjects, but that's particularly difficult because you have so much to have. It's difficult to block out factors that. If you want to study just how does wood affects your health, and you have to block out a lot of other factors in your life, the way you're living, what you're eating, where you're living, and what you're working with. There's so many other factors that you cannot block out easily. So studies are in particular difficult, but there are studies that show for sure that there are positive effects, but those studies are quite small, and they are not randomized really, because you cannot affect a person for wood without the person knowing it. So blind studies are quite difficult, but even so, there are studies that show that reduction of stress, a higher degree of concentration in school, that might be depending that stress is lowered, and also the blood pressure goes down. And those are really interesting. There are some studies there was a study called Wood to Wood? No? Is that a Wood to Wood a couple of years ago? That was a collection
Yes.
Of studies made in Finland, Sweden, and Norway, and I think it was a Norwegian
And the UK,
study.
yes.
And in the UK also, and that showed that the blood pressure gets down and stress levels. But what in that particular study they showed that it was wood and trees. But it was also if you had a photo of a tree. So that just made the researchers pose any more questions after that study. That okay, is it actually that is a photo of a tree that gets the low pressure to decrease, or what is it? And so there is a continuation of that. For example, in Skellefteå Orthopedic Clinic, just recently started up So
Yes.
it's very exciting to see what they come up with also.
Yeah, it's exciting. There is a number of studies
Yeah.
ongoing.
And I think if you take the technical aspect and try to quantify what visible timber does to the indoor climate, we have questions such as moisture content in the air and temperature shifts and how the wood helps us sort of even out
To regulate.
the indoor climate. Yeah, and regulate the indoor climate. Thank you. So I think it's quite inherent, and there's not a lot of research, as you said, and it's hard to do these kinds of research with control groups, and you have to build basically the similar building with and without wood and those kinds of aspects. But it's for me as a structural engineer, if we expose the structure, we also have to make sure that we create a building in which the indoor climate basically provides for the timber structure, which means timber is a living material. And so we have to think about moisture content and temperature shifts and all those kinds of things in the design to be able to have the timber structure. And when we think about that, it's the same things that the inhabitants want. An even moisture content and not a lot of temperature shifts. So if we're designing for timber as a living material, we're also inherently designing for living people to be in the building. And I think we get some things for free there. And I think that we have just seen the start of that. I think there's a lot to be done for, say, the installation technology, because we don't know how to redesign those when we have a lot of visible timber. So we're still using the same systems that we use for other buildings, but then we also have the timber. So maybe sometimes we're doubling up on the indoor climate control systems. And those kind of studies would be also very, very good to have to back up the economical argument as well.
And the forthcoming development.
Yeah.
But what is different then? You say that timber is a living material. What is different? What is different between timber and concrete or steel in that perspective?
Well, basically it has a lot to do with moisture content and temperature. So you have to design the structure to be a little bit flexible, because timber moves. And this always freaks people out when they're doing a structure and you say that it will move. It will change shape between winter and summer, even if it's in an indoor climate. It will change, and we have data so that we know how much it changes. But when you design connections or the column and beam systems, you have to take into account these shifts. And that makes you inherently want to be very specific about what moisture content will we have in this building, at what point, what is this if it's a rental unit, for example, what is it going to be used for? If it's an office, or is it a swimming pool? You want to be able early to control moisture and temperature to be able to design a correct timber structure. And that means that your client have to think about these things, and then any problems that might have occurred when the inhabitants entered the building are actually discovered early on, because you need to know them to design the structure. So it's not that you don't think about this when you build with other materials. It's just you might think about them at a stage where you have to put in other kinds of solutions, because you've missed them from the start. And with timber, we don't miss them because we have to think about them.
The classical question is always, have you made the calculations for where the stairs stops?
Yeah.
And where we have the connecting slabs to the stairs, so we don't forget that.
Yeah. Allow for movement, and maybe elevators need to be able to be adjusted after a couple of years, because we've had some movements, and all of these things have to do with moisture and temperature, which is also what affects us as inhabitants of the building.
But could those material properties, could they also be an advantage? Or
yeah, I think so. I mean, there's been a couple of years ago, there were a lot of talk about just the moisture regulation in buildings and how timber can help, and also to keep an even temperature. But we need basically solid data to be able to actually use this in a practical way.
I mean, you have the vaporization, how the moisture goes from inside the room and then vaporize through the wall, and we know that physical process actually gives away some heat on certain conditions. So the heat flow from the indoor to the outdoor, it doesn't behave exactly the same as with a normal wall, sort of. And I'm not sure, I don't have the latest data on that, because I know that a couple of years ago it was very difficult and almost impossible to make calculations on that. I think it's a woman in Gothenburg who is doing research on that. And do you know if they have come up with a model for mathematically being able to put a usable calculation on that?
Yeah.
You can see it happens when you, for example, in Cederhusen, I think.
Yeah.
That they made a calculation before, the normal way of how thick of insulation do we need in this wall, and then they could check afterwards a couple of years later and see that we should have had a couple of inches less of insulation, and we still made it. Because there's something happening that we know and know how it works, but it's very difficult to make mathematically calculations upon it.
So we need more data. As you mentioned, Frida, this development now, even here in Sweden, we were a little bit slow in the start. Before we get the development of tall buildings in wood and the whole evolution of mass timber buildings, but now we have them, and hopefully, are we doing research on the houses that we build now? How does it look? Do you know that?
Yeah, I think, and as Karin mentioned earlier before, it's a very open industry in Sweden. Is my perspective as well, that people share their knowledge, and there's a lot of knowledge exchange going on, and you're not afraid to use your project and go out and tell people what you've built. But I think for data, there's a little bit of a lack in the the buildings that were built maybe 10 years ago with mass timber in Sweden. There's a lot of things that we feel now that somebody should have, either done a measurement on the building or calculated before, so that we can have, because for us, it's, as engineers, it's important to have the difference, what is the theoretically calculated value and what is the real one. And for a lot of projects, we might have the real one now, but we don't really know what the theoretical calculation was, and maybe that's because it turns out they weren't really in the right space and they don't want to give that out. But it's I feel like there's still a lot to be done, actually, with regards to data feedback, and I'm hoping that there will be a lot more in the coming years, because also you want the buildings to be there for a time. So we're coming up to a point now where a lot of buildings have been there for 10, maybe 20 years, and that's really when the data is, because if you just measure for a year, then that's not statistically really viable. So you'd have to have this time span, and now we're coming up to an interesting point where I feel like we should be able to get a lot of data back from the structures that we built 10 years ago, and that would be useful, because that would guide us to know, what margins do we have in our calculations. And I think that there are some clients that have built things maybe 20 years ago that were sort of pioneers then, and they know that everything, or some aspects at least, turned out, better than calculated, and they want to use that in their next project. But then there's legislation or things that need to change. So the shift is going to come, I'm sure, but there's still a lot of work to be done.
But then, of course, we have 100 professors in concrete and steel and 1 in wood. If you look up at the university, so I mean, my and your wish also, of course, is that the balance would be a little bit different, and that we would reach much further, I think.
Yes, time to step up also in the academia to support
definitely
this development. It's perhaps also a bit of a new role for the wood industry and the wood construction industry, since, we're from just a few years ago, the sawmill industry and the wood industry was very much focused on
material production
and selling huge volumes of wood over the world. But now we're developing this industry jointly. I think it's also an extremely interesting time now, when we also have this kind of a history where we have the first perhaps 10 years or even 20 years old, the buildings in timber. And that also, I think, makes us come into the discussion on how could timber and health issues be applied on the existing buildings. I mean, most of the buildings in a city are already the built ones that we should take care of and in the best possible way also give a prolonged life. So circular use of existing buildings and circular use of timber.
First, we have a huge demand of renovation in Sweden and in Europe and in the rest of the world also, I guess. And that is one of the big issues that we have to take care of in the future. And I think that renovating with wood is one very simple way to try to prolong life instead of tearing down. And I think that there are great possibilities. And there is also that we have to address climate change, that, for example, in the issue up here in Scandinavia, is perhaps that we have to add ways of shading that we didn't have to think about at all previously, and to work with outdoor structures to add on perhaps wooden shading on existing building. That would be one way. So I think that wood really has a role to play also in renovation and in adding on existing buildings. So yeah.
And also in this kind of hopefully post-pandemic era where we learned that we are to meet outdoors to a much higher extent.
Yeah. And then of course also the issue of if we want to build more, we can build on existing house, and then wood again is a way with the lightness to be able to add on an existing building.
Yeah, renovations without adding a lot of new load, basically.
Yeah.
So timber is quite a lightweight material, so that would and add floors and change the usage of the building. But if we look at renovations, if we go back a little bit longer in time, I mean, we have a lot of structures in Sweden today with old timber structures. And I think we're in a good place now to start to look at those structures, because we know a lot more about timber building now than we did, because as I said, there's a knowledge gap because of these sort of lost generations where we didn't build a lot of tall timber or large timber buildings. And now we can go back. So the central station in Stockholm, for example, that's a timber building. It's not in need of any renovation that I know, but it's fun that the people are using these buildings. They don't know that they're timber buildings. And then there was a loss of knowledge, and now we're going back to maybe do renovations on some of our older stock of housing and rental units, and we have an advantage now because we know a lot more about modern timber techniques that we can apply to the old structures, and we don't have to tear them out. We can add to them, or we can at least calculate them properly and know how they will work for another 5 or 200 years. So I think we're in a timber has definitely a role to play, and you're going to need a timber engineer if you want to look at your old structure. So you don't want to take in someone, because if you take in someone who's specialized in concrete, it's going to be difficult for you. So I think we have a better knowledge base now to do those kinds of renovations than we did maybe 10 years ago.
So it's kind of also regaining the knowledge that we had.
Yeah.
And the central station is 100 years old.
Yeah.
I think next year or yes.
Yeah, and even if what we've learned in the last couple of years has a lot to do with modern timber building, if we talk about CLT and glulam and those kinds of larger structures, to understand those, you have to understand basically the tree in its simplest form. So you will understand also and have to learn about older timber structures first before you move on to those. So there's a knowledge now that we can use for the renovations and circularity and all those sustainability issues.
You both mentioned that you have a lot of interest from your clients, and there is a huge interest for wood for both for environmental reasons, but also for health and well-being, and also cost is now also becoming one of the issues that perhaps talks pro wood. It's time for us to wrap up and go down to Dubai and to learn whether there are any questions. But what would be your your advice for the knowledge sharing and for the accelerating the knowledge that we have towards the construction industry and to help spreading?
To keep meeting and keep on with the discussion, and that no questions are too stupid, that we really have to share among each other. Keep meeting. That's the
Keep meeting, keep talking, keep asking too, because sometimes you think you're the only one thinking about a question, but if you just put it out in open forums, there might be somebody else who's already gone through that. So keep meeting definitely and keep asking. Yep.
Thank you very much. Before we totally wrap up, we go down to Dubai and to Annika. And Annika, we heard that keep asking and keep meeting. That's exactly what you do in down at the forest in Dubai. Do you have any questions from your audience there?
Yes, just a short comment. It's been really interesting to follow the story behind the re-entry of timber buildings to the market. Yes, I have one question from the chat, and it reads like this: if you're allergic, could it be a problem living in a house with visible wood? So are there any studies of this, as far as you know?
Yes, there are. And this is also from Wood to New. I said wrong before. The Wood to New study, I think it was 3 years ago, and there was done research on emissions. And yes, wood has emissions, and they rise quite steeply the first couple of months, and then they decrease very steeply and is kept at a quite low level. And they made a comparison with a normal gypsum and concrete building, where there was an increase in emission when the house was new built, not as high as with wood. Then it also decreased, but it kept going on and on and on a much higher level than for wood. So I would say if you have allergic issues, you can very well go and live in a house with visible wood, but perhaps you should just wait a couple of months, like 3 or 4 months, before you move into that or the workplace, or because after that it declines very, very steeply and then keeps at a very low level. So the question is very good.
Thank you. That was really a clear answer to that question. I just have one remaining question for you, and that is how do you look upon the idea of circularity and reuse of materials and related to this kind of sustainable buildings?
Would you?
So if we look to the structure as a timber structure, I guess in this case, then what we see when we get the ask from clients to use circularity, or you're able to basically detach the structural members from each other, our perception is that it's you have to think about it when you design with timber, because as I said before, timber swells and moves a little bit. So if you just use nailing and bolts, and you might lose them in the timber and not know where they are. But if you design the connections correctly, it's very it's not easy, but it's easier to take apart and have sort of integral parts still whole or solid. Basically, if you compare it to steel or concrete, where if you have concrete with rebars in it, you have to basically crush it completely to reuse it, or you need to use the full element in the same shape and just move it. Whereas with timber, it's easier to sort of redesign it. You can use it's basic tools, a drill or a saw, or what you need to take it apart again.
We have always been, for thousands of years, reusing timber structures. And so that's something we know how to do, and we work a lot with renovation of older buildings also in our company, and we keep buildings alive that are like 500 years old or older, and so reusing, that's no problem with wood, I would say.
Yeah, and the moving of the products as well. If you have them in one project, you take them down, you want to move them because it's a more lightweight material. The transportation is easier than with concrete or steel. You'd need heavy lifting cranes and things like that.
But I think we can design fixtures in a better way.
Yes.
Today, so that we could help out with that part. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Susanne, we actually have a question from the audience. If we have time, I would like to put this one through.
Thank you. My name is Henrik Edlund. I work with a company called Organowood. So I work with wood for outdoor use, but I'm really interested about the health effects of wood, visible wood indoor. Do you think that would prove to be a universal health effect or universal effect on people in like this region where wood is a scarce commodity?
That's a very, very interesting question, because my opinion is that the cultural effect on how you react to wood is very, very present. There are some research is done, for example, there's a lot of studies in Japan where wood is considered to give very, very strong health effects. But that's also a culture where wood is looked upon as something very, very positive in most instances. And I would say that goes for Sweden as well. We have a cultural history that even if you're not moving around in forest and not living in a wooden house, there is still a very positive atmosphere around wood. And that, I think that affects you very much. The question is, as the human being has, if you go like 1 million years back, we have a commodity or something for having a natural environment, being in the forest more than being in a non-forest. And that's quite an interesting question to see. Do we have something in our genes that makes us positive, gives us a positive impact? And I don't know. There are studies of that as well, but that's more like in forest therapy, and that's not indoor climate and indoor wood.
Yeah, it's a complex question, and I think it comes down to also the feeling of feeling safe or feeling protected in a building. And in Sweden, as you mentioned, in our culture, we're kind of used to timber, and it has a positive sort of annotation, or we believe it to be a positive thing with timber. But if you're not used to it, you might feel not scared, but you might feel uneasy if you're not used to, say, being in a tall timber building, for example. If you're not completely familiar with it and how it works, it might feel alien to you, and you might feel stressed because of that. And then it obviously doesn't have a health effect that it's timber. It doesn't have a positive health effect, at least. So, yeah.
But then I think it turns a little bit into my subject that I care very much for, and that is, how do you create as an architect a space, a room that gives your empowerment also. That is not, so I mean, if you go into some rooms, some styles of architecture, you can get a very positive and strong feeling that the room empowers you. Like, for example, a church can have, or Gothic.
Feel taller.
And that's how do you use the natural wood in that aspect to enhance your interpretation and your feeling of space. That's really interesting, I think, and that is something that we have to develop further, because today we are mostly talking about the new development in wood as a construction material that we use as if it was a concrete slab.
Yeah.
The pavilion in Dubai is specifically not doing that. The pavilion in Dubai is used really the uprising, the forest as a metaphor, and that's really beautiful, I think. And that's something we have to develop much more, architects and engineers together.
Yeah.
Thank you, Susanne. I think that's all from us.
Okay, thank you, Annika. We actually have some questions from the chat, so we try to cover as many as we have time for the remaining minutes. One question is, what is the input from the architect and designers with regards, for example, hospitals built in wood? Mm-hmm. Are there any legislation or technical demands that hinder such a building?
So this is very connected, I guess, to wood and health and the health kind of buildings. And I would say for hospitals, there are some aspects of hospitals that maybe are not suitable for timber. You could use timber, but you'd have to sort of work with it in a way that it's not really rational to use timber anymore. So say, for example, you have X-ray equipment or MRI machines, and they have very high demands on deflections of floors, and the rays shouldn't be able to escape, and you have aspects such as air tightness of some rooms with regards to spread of infection. So you'd have to look at the specific parts of a hospital, but I think there are a lot of aspects where you could use timber. So for administrative buildings or for recovery rooms, for example, we see a huge part of hospital. It's usually a full hospital area with lots of different buildings. And I don't think today there's any legislation or anything hindering it. There's some technical aspects that might make it harder in some parts. But I think it's also something that we want to see sort of Sweden's first timber hospital, especially if we can use the aspects of seeing the timber as a positive aspect, then that would be interesting. But I don't see any hindrance more than certain technical aspects in certain parts of a hospital.
But that then is what is being a study done on Skellefteå orthopedic hospital, and it's recently started. And I got information from Thomas Nord yesterday, I think it was, that there are two questions. One question is about the emissions coming from wood, because they are using, I think it was 60% of wood cover inside the rooms of a pre or post-op operation. And they are measuring the emissions. And the wood they use has to be lacquered so that so the wood is possible to clean and have a really clean area. So they have the hospital standards of lacquer, so the surface is really tight, and still they measure the emissions to really check if something is coming out of the wood. And then the second question is whether the pain, if there is a pain reduction in being surrounded with wood, if you feel less pain and also need less painkillers after an operation, and also if you can shorten the time you spend on an operation after, if you're having that surroundings, aftercare, because that has been pointed at that might be the effects in other studies. So they want to be able to repeat the studies, and that is the important thing, that if you should be really sure of the analysis of a study, it has to be possible to repeat the studies and get the same result. So that's one very important issue. And if that is proved to be possible to repeat the study, then it's of course a very huge thing economically, that by designing the surrounding in a hospital with more wood, you can get a direct economical input that it's profitable to do that. And it's also nicer if you, as a patient, feel less pain and get out of there quicker. So it's a win-win situation, sort of.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. No legislational hinders and perhaps also some positive studies regarding the health benefits. We have one quick question more. Are there aspects to timber and health with regards to the production aspects? For example, the work environment for builders and construction workers, and indeed, very important questions regarding to health. Do you have a really just quite short?
Well,
answer?
yeah, I mean, when we look at production aspects with our clients, with regards to how they build with concrete and steel rather than working with timber, you have the lightness, as I said, it's a lighter material. You can use different machines. You don't have to, do the.
You could get a warmer surrounding much quicker. You don't have to have the cold moisture of drying times and long drying times.
Yeah, I think if you ask if you ask a carpenter who's built one of these large timber houses, do you want to go back and work with concrete and steel? I think most of the people that I've talked to have said no. It's a nicer working environment, but it's hard to quantify, of course. Yeah.
And often mentioned more silent.
Yeah. Also for the neighbors.
Also for the neighbors. Good indeed. So by that, we have to wrap up and close this session. Thank you very much, Karin and Frida, for joining here from Stockholm. Thank you very much. And thank you, Annika and the audience in Dubai. Please join us again after the break. Thank you and bye for now.